Now, if you are a mouth breather, it is guaranteed that you are breathing too excessively or you are over breathing. Just like you can eat too much food or you can drink too much water, you can also breathe too much air. Now, what is going on exactly when we breathe? Well, when we inhale oxygen. And when we exhale, we release a molecule called CO2 or carbon dioxide. Now, most of the time, we think of carbon dioxide as a waste product because it's getting released from our body and we need to get rid of it as much as possible. But this is simply not true. And this is such a horrible way of looking at this. And I guarantee you that once you start to understand the science behind it, you'll realize how important CO2 is, and it'll start to naturally help correct your breathing. Because when you breathe too excessively, you end up releasing too much carbon dioxide. Because you cannot get carbon dioxide from your air. So if you breathe and you start hyperventilating really fast, you're going to get a ton of oxygen going into your body. But you're also going to be expelling a lot of that CO2 that's already in your body. Because you only get CO2 through your body's metabolism. So really the only way to get CO2 is by holding your breath. And actually your body also builds up CO2 when you exercise or when you work out. But if you're just sitting there and you start holding your breath, that's how you start building up your CO2. Now, your CO2 is really important because it's what controls your blood's pH, or the acidity level of your blood. So if you start holding your breath right now and you start holding it for about 30 seconds, you're going to start putting your body into a more acidic mode because you're building up more and more CO2. And when you have more and more CO2, that makes your blood more and more acidic. Now, if you do the exact opposite, if you start hyperventilating and breathing really quickly, you're going to do the exact opposite. You're going to make your blood more alkaline because you're going to start raising the pH of your blood because you're getting rid of all that CO2. Now, the reason that controlling this blood pH is so important is because this is what helps your oxygen get delivered to your cells. So when you breathe in, this oxygen attaches to a molecule called hemoglobin. And this hemoglobin will travel in your red blood cells. And this is what gets delivered to your cells. So basically, your oxygen is a passenger to this train, and the train is hemoglobin. So this hemoglobin will go to all your organs, and it'll drop off this oxygen to get delivered to your cells. But if your pH in your blood is off, then your oxygen cannot get detached. This hemoglobin cannot let go of this oxygen. So then it stays attached to this oxygen. And what happens is your oxygen never gets delivered to your cells. And this is why, again, your CO2 is so important, because if you have enough CO2, then your blood pH will be regulated, and now your oxygen will be able to be delivered to your cells. Now, like I said, most people have become overbreathers. And when you're breathing too excessively, like when you're breathing through your mouth, then you get a condition called hypocapnia, or basically where your CO2 levels are too low. Now, when your CO2 levels are too low, your body can kind of fix it as a sort of temporary measure, because your body kind of makes these buffers that try to basically buffer out that pH and make it at the right level. But when it goes on for too long and your pH is off for a too long period of time, now you get a condition called chronic hypocapnia. And this is where you start to see some real changes occur in your body. Basically what happens when you get hypocapnia is everything kind of constricts. So your breathing tubes will start to constrict, and also your blood vessels will start to constrict. And also you're going to be more likely to get muscle cramps and basically different muscle pains. For example, when you're working out and you get different muscle cramps, that's a sign of hypocapnia. And basically the reason that your body is constricting everything is to try to retain the CO2. So it makes it really hard to exhale or breathe out properly, because your body is desperate to maintain the CO2. Because again, it's trying to maintain that pH balance. Because your pH has to be at a range between 7.35 and 7.45. Now that's a very minuscule range. And if your pH gets too high or too low, then you can actually die. So this is very important for your body. Your body will do anything to keep this pH in check. And that anything includes narrowing your breathing tubes and narrowing your blood vessels. Now, the second problem you get from this hypocapnia and this narrowing of your blood vessels is you get reduced oxygen delivery to your cells. So not only is your blood pH off, and that makes it harder for this oxygen to get delivered to your cells, but now since you have these narrower blood vessels. Now your red blood cells have to fight harder and harder to get to all of your organs. And this makes it so much harder for your oxygen to get to all the right places. And this is one of the reasons why people are so chronically tired, where they're sleeping for 8 hours. They're getting all the sleep that they need, but they're not getting good quality, because no matter how much air they're breathing, they're still breathing through their mouth, they're still snoring, and now all this blood flow is just getting so constricted that they're not getting enough oxygen to their organs and their cells, including the cells in their brain. Now, at the same time, if you have too high levels of CO2, it's going to cause problems in the other direction. Now everything's going to start to dilate, because at the same time, CO2 is a dilator. So now your blood vessels will start to dilate, and this can cause other issues, because now your blood is going to be more alkaline. But like I said, most people are not in that state. Most people are actually in the hypocapnic state, where they're overbreathers. But we want to make sure we have the right ratio. We want to make sure we have enough CO2 and enough oxygen to adequately deliver blood and oxygen to our cells. Now we can do this by breathing correctly. So what is the perfect breath? How can we breathe correctly? Well, the perfect way to breathe actually depends more on the volume of air that you are exchanging. And we can look at basically history and see how breathing rates have changed, and we can see what an ideal amount of volume of air to breathe is. And that is going to be about 5.5 liters of air per minute. Now you might be wondering, how in the world am I going to measure how much air I am exchanging in and out of my lungs? Well, to put it in perspective, humans right now are breathing about 12 liters of air per minute. So humans right now are breathing about double or more than double the amount of air that they're supposed to be breathing. So for most people, they will benefit from reducing the amount of air they're breathing and breathing lighter. So some people will say that the perfect breath should be inhaling for 5 seconds and exhaling for 5 seconds. Well, that doesn't really tell you everything, because you can be breathing for 5 seconds and take a really huge inhale, like I couldn't hold that for 5 seconds, but you could also be inhaling for 5 seconds and go really lightly, like you probably couldn't even see me inhaling there. So you can't get a good gauge of your volume when you are timing your breaths like that. So you want to make sure that if you are timing your breaths, you want to make sure that you're also checking the volume of air that you're breathing. And for most people, it's going to be learning how to breathe lighter and learning how to have a slightly shortage of oxygen, and basically getting used to a slightly higher amount of carbon dioxide. Because what we've seen is it's not just the oxygen that gets into your lungs. It's getting that oxygen to go from your lungs to go to your organs. That is the real issue. And in order to do that, you have to raise your CO2 levels. And lowering your oxygen levels slightly is not going to do anything. It's actually going to benefit you, because, for example, if you look at a pulse oximeter, that's basically that thing you put on your finger and it checks your oxygen saturation, or in other words, how much oxygen is in your lungs and attached to your hemoglobin. Most people will have an oxygen saturation of between 95 and 100%. That's a very healthy number. But if people learn how to reduce their breathing, they can still maintain that really high level of oxygen saturation, but at the same time, they can raise the amount of oxygen and blood flow that's going to your organs. That is what your goal should be, and that is what you should be trying to get to. Now, some people will also say that they have a deviated septum, or they always have this nasal congestion, and there's simply no way that they can breathe through their nose. Well, the funny thing is that means that you need to breathe through your nose more, because mouth breathing actually causes nasal congestion, and I'll explain why. So basically, your brain has two breathing receptors. One of them is going to monitor whether you're breathing in and out through your nose or in and out through your mouth. So that one I'm not really going to focus on. The second breathing receptor monitors the volume of air that's coming in and out of your lungs. So if it senses that the volume of air that's coming in and out is too high, that means that you're losing too much CO2. And if it senses that you're losing too much CO2, it's going to do anything and everything to hold in that CO2. Like I said, your body's main goal is to maintain that blood pH. And if you're losing too much CO2, then your body has to find a way to retain that CO2. Now, this breathing receptor will stimulate these things called your goblet cells in your nose. Your goblet cells are what secrete more and more mucus. So if you're breathing too excessively and that volume of air that's going in and out of your lungs is too much, then your nose is going to be more and more stuffy. Now, if that same person were to learn how to breathe lightly and breathe less, then their nose will slowly start to open up and their sinuses will slowly start to open up. What they might find is that first few weeks of learning how to breathe correctly, they might have a lot of drainage in their sinuses because all that leftover mucus is basically coming out. But after those few weeks, if they keep it up and keep it consistent, then they'll be able to start breathing through their nose again. Now, I also have a trick on how to unblock your nose and kind of speed up this process. And I made it in some other videos, and I'm gonna go over it again in this video. So basically what you need to do is a normal inhale and exhale. And after that exhale, you're gonna hold your breath. So you're gonna put one finger over your mouth and one finger over your nose, like that. And then you're gonna walk. You're gonna walk as many paces as you can until you have a medium to strong urge to breathe. So I'm gonna go like this and pretend like I'm walking. If you don't wanna walk, or if you don't have enough room to walk, you can also try bobbing your head. It's gonna do the same thing. So again, it's gonna look like this. Again, you do that until you have a medium to strong urge to breathe, and then you're gonna recover by breathing through your nose for 1 minute. It's really important to only use your nose here because after this exercise, everything is gonna start to open up. But if you start breathing through your mouth again, then your nose is gonna start constricting again. So you wanna repeat this exercise for a total of 6 times. If you keep this up 6 times, then you should be able to breathe through your nose again. Now, there are some other steps to this exercise if that alone does not work. So I'm gonna put a link in the description below where I go over it in detail. Now, I know I said with proper breathing that the timing of air coming in and out of your lungs doesn't really matter, but the ratio of how long you're inhaling to exhaling does matter. So most people should have a ratio of 40% of the time inhaling and 60% of the time exhaling. You might be wondering why, and I'll explain why. Basically, anytime you're inhaling, that will drive the stress response in your body, or that will drive the sympathetic nervous system, which is your body's stress mode. And anytime you're exhaling, that will drive your body's parasympathetic nervous system, which is basically your body's rest and relax mode. So most people, you need to have a ratio. So you don't want to have a 50-50 ratio. Most people should have a 40 to 60% ratio. But right now, most people have the opposite. They have about 60% of the time they're inhaling and 40% of the time they're actually exhaling. So as a result, people tend to get more and more into this chronic stress state. And this is where chronic stress can become a real problem. And this is where we start to get different from our ancestors, where our ancestors did not have this problem of being in chronic stress. Yes, our ancestors were stressed out at times because they had to fight bears and lions or whatever, or because they would lose a loved one, because they would go out hunting and they might never come back. But that stress is different than our stress today. And our stress today is not how stress was meant to be. And there was actually a study showing that this ratio of breathing can actually help relax someone that was stressed out. So what they did was they took these people and they forced them to become in a stressed out mode. So they made them basically breathe in and out really quickly until they activated their sympathetic nervous system. And then after, they had them practice these prolonged exhales. So they had them do these 4-second inhales and these 6-second exhales. And what they found is this activated their parasympathetic nervous system, and this really helped calm and relax them. And the thing is, if you are chronically stressed, your body can kind of naturally prolong your exhales. So it does this by sighing. So if you ever catch yourself like sighing throughout the day, or something stresses you out, or if you see someone else sigh regularly throughout the day, that means that one, that person is stressed out. But also, that means that their body is trying to force them to be more in a parasympathetic or rest and relax mode, because it's forcing them to start prolonging their exhales by doing that sigh and forcing them to become in a more rest and relax mode. That's why when people sigh, they feel more relief. But what you want to focus on is breathing correctly so you do not have to resort to that sigh, and so that you're not in a chronically stressed out state. People who breathe correctly, meaning they're breathing lighter than the average person, are able to supply more oxygen and more blood to all of their cells and their organs. And at the same time, people who breathe too excessively are going to be more at risk for having chronic, severe health problems. So just to give an example of this, when someone's heart stops, that person should immediately be receiving CPR. But for a long time, when we were doing CPR, we would focus on not just the compressions, which is basically trying to restart their heart, but also ventilation by putting more air into their lungs. Because for someone receiving CPR, they're both not breathing and their pulse has stopped, meaning their heart is not beating. But studies have found that too much ventilation during CPR can actually hinder that person's survival. And there's actually been multiple times where researchers found that when people were doing CPR, the person actually died because of too much ventilation, where they were putting too much air into their lungs. Not too long ago, when I used to go to CPR training, they would really focus on ventilation and compressions. But now when I went to my most recent CPR, and even the one before that, the ventilation really wasn't even a key part. And actually in the last one, we didn't even touch ventilation at all. They mentioned it, but we really only focused on compressions. And the reason is that you can kill someone by giving them too much air. So if anything, during these CPR training, what they really need to focus on is how to not give too much air to someone if they're going to do ventilation. So if you want to fix your breathing, for most people, it's going to be getting used to a lower level of oxygen and getting used to a higher level of CO2 in your blood. Now, the reason that you have to get used to this is because your brain has this sort of trigger. So this trigger is going to detect your CO2 levels. And if it detects that your CO2 levels rise to a certain point, it's going to basically automatically make you take the next breath. But if you start breathing too excessively and you start becoming a mouth breather and you start breathing faster and faster, then your CO2 levels are never going to reach that point. And your brain is going to think that, hey, this CO2 level checkpoint shouldn't be here. It should actually be down here. So that is going to further cause you to subconsciously be breathing faster and faster. So you need to get comfortable by having this higher threshold of CO2 and also get comfortable having a lower amount of oxygen. And you might think that getting comfortable with the lower amount of oxygen might actually be depriving you of oxygen, but actually it's going to do the opposite. And it's going to actually deliver more oxygen to your cells. So there was a study kind of showing this, where they took people and they put them under hypoxia conditions, where they basically forced them to breathe less amount of oxygen. But one of the groups was a control, meaning they just had normal air, just less oxygen. But the two other groups both had carbon dioxide mixed in their air. So one of the groups had 3% CO2 mixed in, and the third group had 5% CO2 mixed in. And what they found is the first group, or the control group that had no CO2, their oxygen levels quickly dropped, and it took a really long time for them to recover when they took them out of that hypoxia condition. Now, the other two groups, they did a lot better. So the 3% CO2 group, their oxygen levels really didn't drop that much, and they actually recovered really quickly. Now, the 5% group was even better. They barely even dropped their oxygen levels at all. And they also recovered to the point where they were even better than before. So the groups that had CO2 mixed in their air, they were actually better off after the exercise than before. So before they even started, their oxygen levels were lower than at the end of the study, meaning more CO2 in their air help them retain more oxygen. So one of the best ways to get comfortable with this lower level of oxygen, higher level of CO2, is doing high altitude training. And this is the reason why so many people go to Kenya or these different mountains or Colorado to train in these higher altitude areas. Because when they come back to normal land, they're basically a superhuman because they have way more oxygen and blood delivery to their cells. But there's a way to naturally do this at home. And the way to naturally do this at home is basically going to involve holding your breath. Because when you hold your breath, you're depriving yourself of oxygen and you're also increasing your amount of CO2. So when you practice this breath holding, there are two keys that you want to focus on. One is you want to always do it after an exhale. So after you exhale through your nose, that's when you want to do the breath hold. And number two is you don't want to hold it too long. So you don't want to wait until you're gasping and dying for air. You want to wait for basically a medium to strong urge to breathe. Now, what is a medium to strong urge to breathe? Basically, it's when you're able to recover your breathing in 1 to 2 breaths. If you require more breaths or you have to start opening your mouth and start gasping for air, that means you held your breath too long. So one way to do this high altitude training is when you're just sitting and working on something, you can just do the exhale and start holding your breath until you get that medium to strong urge to breathe, and then recover for about 30 seconds to a minute. And then after you recover, repeat this and do it for a total of 10 times. And you can actually also do this when you're working out. So I would recommend doing this mainly when you are doing some sort of cardio. So whether you're biking or rowing or going for a run. I would not recommend doing this when you're swimming, because any sort of breath holding when you're swimming, unless you're a very good professional, is not a good idea, because there is a chance that you might get lightheaded or something like that, and you do not want to be in a pool when that happens to you. So something that I like to do is anytime I'm cycling is I like to warm up for a minute first and then start doing the breath holds. So I'll start cycling for a minute, and then after I'm warmed up, I'll try holding my breath. And usually I'll shoot for 10 seconds. Now, before I used to only shoot for 5 seconds. So now I've got up to 10 seconds. And what you'll find is the more you start doing this, the longer you'll be able to hold your breath comfortably and be able to basically tolerate this oxygen shortage. And all this is doing is basically building up your CO2 tolerance. And as a result, that threshold for you to take your next breath will start to go up and up. And this will naturally start to lower your breathing rate. Now, another really good time to do this exercise is as a warm-up. So have you ever had that feeling of when you're going on a run and initially you start to feel like you're out of breath? Like in that first minute of your run, you're like, oh my God, I cannot keep this up. But then after 10 minutes of running, you're like, oh, I feel great. I can just keep going. The reason is because initially your body's not used to that higher level of CO2 that you get from running and that lower level of oxygen that you get when you start increasing your breathing rate. But if you were to do this exercise when you warm up and you start practicing these breath holds, for example, while you're going for a walk before you go for your run, then your body's going to be already used to that higher level of CO2. That way, when you start going on your run, you're going to be way less likely to be out of breath in the beginning of that run. Now, the second way to get comfortable with higher levels of CO2 and lower levels of oxygen and to start breathing correctly is anytime you are not exercising, to only use your nose to breathe. Now, you may be thinking that you always use your nose to breathe and that you never open your mouth, but really check yourself. Like, check yourself next time you're watching TV or reading a book or sleeping on an airplane, and see if you ever catch yourself with your mouth open, or if someone ever tells you that you were sleeping with your mouth open, or if someone takes a picture of you when you're sleeping on a family trip or something and you see that your mouth is open. Those are all signs that you're a mouth breather. So throughout the day, we can consciously kind of remind ourselves to be breathing through our nose. But when we're sleeping, a trick you can do is to basically put a strip of tape over your mouth. So what I like to use is something called 3M micropore paper tape. I got this one that's 1/2 inch thick because that thickness is perfect for just my lips and it doesn't touch my mustache or my beard hairs. And I hate that feeling of taking tape off my mouth and it catches any of my hairs because it's painful. There's also been plenty of studies that show that when you use this mouth tape, it can actually help prevent sleep apnea or potentially even cure sleep apnea. Now, if you want to take this one step further, I'd also recommend using a nasal dilator over your nose, which is basically either a strip of tape that goes over your nose, or sometimes you can put an internal dilator, which is something that clips on inside of your nose and helps dilate your nose that way. There's different types on Amazon. I like using something called like the Breathe Right strips, which are really common, and it's really simple to use. You just put basically a piece of tape over your nose. If you use this combined with the mouth tape, it's really going to help improve your sleep. Because looking now at nasal dilators, there's also studies showing that when people use this nasal dilator and they're able to improve the amount of air that's going through their nose, this can also help cure sleep apnea in some people and even help lower their sleep apnea symptoms. And there's also studies showing that this can help fight insomnia. So if you combine this nasal dilator and this mouth tape, this is a really simple way to improve your sleep, but also help train your body to regularly breathe through your nose. The leading cause of accidental deaths from people 65 and older is falling. Literally falling down. And this is not even counting the people who fall and then later die a year later because of some sort of other problem that stemmed from that fall. And this is where having enough muscle mass and specifically muscular strength